Okay, so to start, this is the precipitation percentiles for 2024. So anything that you see kind of in the green means we were wetter than average, and anything in the brown means drier than average. So technically up in this part of the state, you were either kind of around average or slightly above. Now that didn't tell the whole story because it was very, very wet up here for a good portion of the spring, early summer. And then the spigot kind of shut off in the summer, and it really shut off this past fall. Now you guys got a little bit of moisture up here in November, December, but not necessarily enough to offset what you didn't get earlier in the fall. Conditions were much worse as you go further west. So parts of Panhandle was one of the driest years on record, and they had some pretty extreme drought conditions to deal with out there. Temperature, with a couple of exceptions, one being right around this time last year, another being a little bit in August. We were consistently above average last year, so for the year 2024 came in as the second warmest on record for the state. For Norfolk in general, it was the second warmest on record, and for the U.S. as a whole, it was the warmest on record, as it was for the globe. So we broke the record we had set in 2023. 2025 will likely be cooler than 24 and 23 because we are not expecting to be going back into an El Nino. Okay, just kind of give a little bit of a drought update. Now again, I made these slides yesterday. Drought monitor comes out on Thursday morning. It's based on data that goes through Tuesday morning. So the cutoff for the drought monitor is on Tuesday morning at 7 Central. So if you do get precipitation on Tuesday night or Wednesday, that will not be reflected until potentially the week after. That lag is in part just because there is a lot of correspondence with the drought monitor author. I am the one who is the official correspondent with the drought monitor author or authors every single week, so I solicit feedback from people from elsewhere at Extension and from the National Weather Service office and try to say, yeah, we think this should be degraded, this should be improved. Sometimes I get what I want, sometimes I don't. I generally try to err, let's put it this way, if it's borderline, I generally just ask for it to stay in drought or some level of drought, because I understand that there are payments tied toward a certain drought category being around for enough number of weeks. So if there's justification indicators, I generally push for it. If justification isn't there, I won't, but if it's there, I will push for it. Okay, looking at the country as a whole, a lot of the country technically actually was a little bit above average or around average for precipitation in 2024, but because it was so dry late summer and then through most of the fall, we actually did see rapid development of drought across a lot of the country, including the eastern U.S. Here in Nebraska, we have about 90% of the state currently in drought, so we did see additional drought put on the drought monitor this week in parts of southwestern Nebraska, where they basically have not had any measurable precipitation or any meaningful precipitation now for about 60 days. You go further west, we have a lot of extreme drought in the Panhandle, and right up here in this part of the state, you're either in moderate drought or severe drought, depending on your location. Again, this is pretty much all a result of what happened, starting kind of midsummer and then especially through the fall. And we did have portions of northeastern Nebraska that were in extreme drought for a good portion of the latter half of the fall, and very deservedly so, in my opinion, just given, there were pockets where we had, actually, I think there was places in Wayne County that literally had no precipitation for like 60 days or something, from late August through October. Something else that's, I would say, is at least mildly concerning, if not real concerning on some level, is just the complete lack of snowfall in this area and for a lot of this part of the country. Now, we have had a couple of storm systems come into the central United States in the last month. We did get a decent rain in the eastern half of the state in late December. Some of that presumably went in, since the ground at that point wasn't all that frozen yet. But you'll notice that, now these numbers may be a little bit hard to read, but this basically is showing that for most of Nebraska, we're running at least 10 inches behind normal on snowfall for the year, and there are parts of the state that are probably getting closer to 1.5 foot in deficit snowfall. Now, snowfall is not necessarily by itself going to break the drought, but what snowfall does that's very helpful is it helps basically kind of keep a lid on the moisture that you do have in there. It means that you're not going to have it evaporating out of the soil on the days where it's warmer and windier, and it can help reduce or limit soil erosion that you can get if you have open ground and a lot of wind. So this isn't good. Now, I want you to keep in mind this picture. So, where we have had a lot of snow this year is kind of I-70 corridor from Kansas and Missouri, downstate Illinois. Where we haven't had it's Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota. And this was put out earlier in the fall, basically showing that in weak La Ninas, we tend to have a lot of snowfall up in here. We don't tend to have a lot of it down here. So Mother Nature has a sense of humor and has basically done about the exact opposite of what this was showing. There is still definitely a chance as we head into February we could start getting more routine systems coming in that would give us chances of snowfall, but for the next, I'd say 7 to 10 days, don't expect much of the white stuff on the ground out there. Okay, in case this is of interest to anybody, this is a snow water equivalent. So basically there are a number of stations at higher elevations that just kind of measure how much snow is on the ground. They kind of have an estimate of the snow water equivalent. Now this is a lot more important for farms and ranches out in western Nebraska that rely a lot more heavily on irrigation water from these rivers. So you'll notice as you have the northern part of the Rockies, we're not in dire straits. We are certainly below where we normally want to be this time of year. Central Rockies, we're in reasonably good shape and well below in the southern portion of the Rockies. Soil moisture percentiles right now, so again, soils right now are mostly frozen, so this, we have the ground's probably going to be what it's not going to change a whole lot. Now this is not literally actual soil moisture. What I'm showing you here is a percentile, so the reds and the oranges and reds and dark reds being much drier than average, and the blues are much wetter than average. So it's basically just for a point in time in the year, are you relatively wet or relatively dry, or very wet or very dry in the top 3.5 feet of your soil profile for this time of year. And this is based on a very robust land surface model. This is not necessarily based on anything observational. So this is in no way meant to actually substitute for actually measuring soil moisture in your own fields to make irrigation decisions or anything else. I simply show this as this kind of gauge of where, how effective maybe recent precipitation is, and just this is really used more for drought monitoring purposes. But I do like showing this just to kind of show where we do have a lot of long-standing deficits in soil moisture, which is, a lot of the north central U.S. I would say here for a lot of eastern Nebraska, we are in much better shape than we were 2 months ago, 3 months ago. But we, by no stretch of imagination, have a full soil profile. So we still are relatively deficient in soil moisture going into spring. We definitely need additional moisture before we get into the next planting season. Any questions on what I've talked about so far? So I've just been kind of giving an update on just current things. I'm going to get into the outlook here a little bit, but I do think it's important just kind of give you guys some sense of what's going on locally. And I also, on Market Journal, to the extent I can, I try to give some indication of what's going on elsewhere in the region around the country, because what happens elsewhere in this country does move markets. At least that's what my uncle always told me. Okay, so 2024 was exceedingly warm for this region and country and the world, but January 2025 so far, we're starting off a bit colder. So we have seen temperatures that are probably a lot more seasonal to even below average. So particularly western Nebraska down to Kansas, where we had a little bit more snow cover. Temperatures this month have been fairly cold relative to the 91 to 2020 average. So up here in most northeast Nebraska, I would say we're kind of running just maybe slightly below the near-term normals, and from a historical perspective, I'd say we're running right around average. If we'd had more snow cover, I would say we probably would be having a fairly cold January so far up in this region. If you've been watching observations on the local news, you may have noticed that it's often been colder in Falls City and Beatrice lately than it's been in Omaha and Lincoln. They've had more snow cover down there. This time of the year, having a lot of snow on the ground can really keep your temperature 5-10 degrees colder than what it would be without the snow cover. Okay, so these are 4-inch soil temperatures under bare soil. So this is these are actual observed temperatures from the Nebraska Mesonet. This is Nebraska Mesonet's been around for quite a while, but this is a new website that my colleague Ruben Benke helped get established about 4 or 5 months ago. It's nemesonet.unl.edu. I encourage you to take a look at it. We do have real-time information now. So it used to be that you just got updates on temperature and dew point and humidity and wind chill every hour. Now it's every minute, and you can see what the max and min was for the day at any time. You also can get things like cattle comfort index, and I think as we get into the summer, we hope to have more specific crop variables for you. These are somewhat algorithm-based, but they are all to some degree based on actual observations that we have at the stations. And Ruben has been very, very good since he's been here in getting grants to help add more stations around the state. We are trying to get some support from the legislature this year in terms of getting some additional funding to keep this, basically kind of help keep this going. We do anticipate hopefully putting some more stations up in this part of the state and further west in north central Nebraska. But you notice in terms of soil temperatures right now, mostly below freezing.
New battery.
I can be very loud too.
Can I ask a question? What was the website you said where it has the soil temperature?
Sure. mesonet.unl.edu.
Mesonet?
Yes, MESONET. Mesonet.unl.edu. I can write it on the board. Okay, we seem to be back in business. And these are current frost depths, so these are a little dated, but I pulled this off another website. You'll notice, so we are starting to get some, soils frozen down a little bit. This region, we're probably somewhere between 7 and 10 inches frozen. Okay, so as you may have heard on local forecasts, we do have some cold weather coming. It's pretty mild today, so we're getting Pacific air right now. That's going to change starting late Friday afternoon, Friday night. The reason that's going to change is in the upper levels, we have strong ridging kind of coming up here toward Alaska, and we're getting the polar express on the downward side of that. So we're bringing pure Arctic air down from northern Canada straight down to the central U.S. So it's going to be pretty cold here starting Saturday, and especially Sunday, Monday. This region, I would expect highs probably in the single digits on both Sunday and Monday. Again, that's not even close to record cold, but it is pretty cold. Wind chills will probably be at least 20 below here on Monday morning. As you get a little bit further north and west, they probably be closer to 30 below. So again, just be prepared, be careful if you have to be out and about. I've talked to a couple of cattle folks. They aren't anticipating this causing a major issue because we have had a little bit of cold weather. This isn't necessarily like life-threatening conditions for them, but this is still pretty cold. It will thankfully only last a couple of days. We should start moderating a little bit Tuesday, and then by this time next week, we should be back in the 30s and 40s across most of the state again. But I do think that we're going to probably have recurring shots of this cold air, and I think as we get to February, I do think there is a possibility that we stay colder than average for a good portion of that month as well. Now again, this is getting closer to more than 10 days out, so I take this a little bit of grain of salt, but I have seen there is some signal in the models that we could get another pretty good shot of cold air coming down as we head toward the end of the month. So again, this is showing really strong ridging here off the coast of Alaska, really strong troughing getting down here into the central and western portion of the U.S. And this type of look, to me, almost indicate that you get here on the eastern side of this trough that we may have a little bit more rising motion, which would mean potentially increased chances for a little bit more snowfall. This is not an indication to me of a blizzard, but this is an indication that we may actually start getting some chances to get 1 or 2 inches of snow on a more regular basis. I would say that if this actually, at some point, if you do see a feature like this, especially about say 2-3 weeks from now, if we do tap into the polar vortex, then we could get some really, really cold air coming down here in a few weeks. That's not an official prediction, but it is something that I am definitely kind of keeping an eye on, and I will try to keep you guys as best informed with that with the Market Journal and KRVN and those sorts of things. So again, this is more of my weather nerd coming out me, but I do like talking about the Baden-Julian oscillation because it does have an impact on our sensible weather in this part of the world. So the NJO is basically it's eastward propagating convection from the eastern side of Africa all the way out to the Pacific Ocean, and those numbers up there mean basically what phase is it in, and the phase that it's in basically is where you have where the main convection is. Where that main convection is has an impact on the Pacific jet streams. It has an impact on where we do have ridges and troughs setting up between Japan and say like Greenland. And when we are so we're likely to go into phase 2 and 3 here the next few weeks. And historically, when we are in phase 2, we do tend to have a look that looks a little bit more like what's about to happen here in the next couple of weeks, where you do have a lot more troughing coming into the western United States, bringing more cold air down. So we do tend to get colder this time of year when we are in those phases. And the CPC currently is in somewhat agreeing with this or thinking about this. And they are right now projecting favoring colder temperatures from basically the last part of January through the first part of February. They're not really showing any strong signal with regard to precipitation. Them showing above average precipitation in the northwest and further east does make sense to me based on the current pattern. And as I kind of mentioned, I do think there is going to be a possibility for us to be certainly colder than average in February. I don't necessarily see really strong signals right now that are going to be super wet or snowy. But if this type of pattern is showing up, or we do have a lot of troughing here, a little bit further to our west, that would mean that we would probably be getting clippers that would be coming in more like this, bringing in more routine cold snaps from the west. That would at least give us chances of getting that more routine 1 to 2, 3 inch snowfalls that we like to traditionally think about getting here this time of year. In terms of where they're looking at above and below average precipitation, so these browns show below average, these greens and blues are above average, basically not really showing anything in our area, but it was not showing below, which is, I consider, a good sign that we maybe will start getting some snow as we head into the month of February. Again, I can't rule out having a big snowstorm. Mother Nature always likes to throw surprises at us, but right now, I don't see anything in the immediate future that suggests we've got a major blizzard coming. But I do definitely see opportunities to get some relatively decent cold in here. Okay, kind of moving on into where we currently are with the sea surface temperature. So we are officially in a La Nina. So La Nina is the cold phase of ENSO. So last year at this time, all the conversation was about El Nino, which is the warm phase, which means when we are El Nino, we tend to see a lot more of these oranges and reds across this whole part of the Pacific Basin, which means that basically when we have El Nino, we have a lot warmer water off the coast of South America and in the Central Pacific because the trade winds that tend to blow from east to west have really weakened or almost reversed. In the last several months, we have seen more upwelling. We've seen at times bursts of easterly trade winds, and we do actually right now have some pretty, relatively speaking, cooler water here across the Central Pacific. So we now are officially in what we would classify as a weak La Nina, and we are starting to. I think what we're starting to see in terms of sensible weather is a little bit more of a traditional La Nina type look. I would say to this point in the winter, certainly in the month of December, we did not have weather that was necessarily wasn't necessarily representative of a traditional La Nina. I forgot to update that. But yeah, we basically right now are in a weak La Nina, and these different things are basically kind of showing the different parts of the Pacific Basin where you monitor. And so we are, definitely have some colder sea surface temperatures in places where it does matter. And the atmosphere also is kind of behaving in a weak La Nina state. Let's see here. It's a forecast. Now, as a lot of you probably may know or do know, even if it's just implicitly from past bad experience, La Nina in the summer and the fall in this part of the country does not tend to be our friend. It's not always the enemy, but it is not usually our friend. So the fact that there is a less than a 30% chance, at least that's the official forecast right now, is for it to be a slightly lower probability of us being in a La Nina as we head into the summer. So the expectation right now is that we probably are getting about the peak of the La Nina, and it's just start weakening and go back into what we kind of call neutral conditions this spring. And we have about an equal, relatively decent chance of staying in more neutral conditions as we head into summer. All things being equal, I think that is a better sign for us for getting more routine moisture in here as we head through the summer. The years where we are going into summer strongly in La Nina, more times than not, I'd say probably 60% of the time, we end up at some point with a long stretch where we just have a lot of ridging over this part of the country that really blocks the moisture coming up from the Gulf of Mexico, and it really blocks the storm systems that would come through here and actually give us precipitation. So to get precipitation, you need the atmospheric forcing and you need the moisture. And for a lot of last fall, we had neither one of those two things in this region. And unfortunately, La Nina, especially if it's coupled with really cold or colder water on the entire eastern side of the Pacific Basin, off the coast of California down toward the Baja, that does tend to, the atmospheric feedback tends to be, puts the trough further west, puts a ridge over the central part of this continent. That really tends to block the moisture source and the storm track for us. So that's basically my story of why La Nina is not always our friend, but sometimes it works out in our favor because the ridge is set up much further south or so far west that we end up being on the beneficiary side of it. Okay, so I'm trying to get toward what you probably came here for, which is 2025 outlook. So I'm going to talk a little about the spring, then I'll get a little bit more into the summer. I'm just going to first show you what the CPC is thinking. This isn't this is their most current map. They will update this, I think, if not today, tomorrow. So unfortunately, the timing of this is such that I didn't have a new update. So I'm showing you is almost a month old at this point. Nevertheless, in late December, they were thinking, in the spring, cooler than average being favored here across the Northwest. No strong signal for us. I would interpret this being that there is a reasonable chance that March may still be a little cold, or at least there will be stretches of time in March. We probably will get some decent cold snaps in here. So at this point, I'm not necessarily really bullish on this having a very, very warm March that would allow for widespread early planting in early April. Not that you guys probably plant that early up here, but they do down closer to Missouri in southeast Nebraska. At least they were last year. Precipitation, they are showing drier than average favored across western Nebraska and down through a lot of the Rockies. Now again, is anybody here from western side of Nebraska? Assuming not, given this is the Northeast Farm Show. Nevertheless, this is very bad news. I mean, I do think this is at least a reasonable probability that they stay dry out there. They're hurting, and particularly parts of Panhandle, they can't really afford to have a really dry spring. Okay, so that's what the CPC is showing. What's the European? So I like showing the European model just because statistically it has the highest skill scores. I'm not saying it's perfect, it's not. But statistically over years it has the best skill scores, and it tends to not always cry wolf with regards to droughts. So I like, if it's showing really dry conditions favored the extended, I tend to, it tends to get my attention a little bit more than some other models that shall remain nameless that are kind of always putting it here. So what are they showing? They were showing we're the average favored here west of us and south of us, but no real strong signal for our area. So I would interpret this as being, right now the projection is not for it to be a significantly warm spring here. That's kind of what the story I'm getting so far from this. And for precipitation, they were actually showing chances for it to be wetter than average here across northeast Nebraska. Now, I don't want it to rain every 3 days starting on April 25th through June 1st, because that's not what you probably want towards getting stuff in the ground. But if that means that we do get, once the ground thaws out, we do get some good rains in March and the first part of April, I would consider that a real blessing because we do need to get moisture back in the ground. We're better off, I would say, in this part of the state than you certainly were at this time in 2023 or 2022 or 2021. But that doesn't mean none of those years are years you really want to be compared to at this point in the year in terms of moisture in the ground. You'll notice that they are projecting a relatively wet spring for pretty much almost the entire stretch of the Corn Belt. Let's see, let me show that. Okay, in terms of the drought outlook, so the CPC puts these out every month. They do a monthly, they do a drought outlook for the month ahead, they do a drought outlook for the season. Sometimes these are really good, sometimes they're useless. This, I think, this actually makes good sense to me. We're already starting to see this, so it's been very, very dry across a lot of the Southwest, so that makes good sense, and they're expecting drought to develop. They were not highlighting southwestern Nebraska, which I thought was kind of odd. I mean, they all were already, as of this current map, and drought some of that area. I do anticipate maybe potentially getting a little bit more improvement across portions of eastern Nebraska. I don't necessarily anticipate us being out of drought in this region by the end of March. We just simply are not likely to get enough precipitation in absolute sense to make up for the deficits that we started incurring here last fall. Okay, now here's what you're maybe even more interested in. This is kind of looking, this is about as far out as I can go currently. So this is looking at May, June, July. And you'll notice that the European model shows a very warm western U.S. But you'll notice that it's white over here in northeast Nebraska, so that basically is showing more average temperatures. Again, this would indicate probably a lot more pronounced ridging further west. When we have a lot of ridging further west in the summer, we tend to get a flow that comes more like this. And if we had decent Gulf moisture coming up here from the south, from late May through August, that does tend to actually give us at least chances of decent precipitation. And I think what you're seeing here in terms of precipitation, they are showing weather than average being favored from eastern Nebraska into Illinois and Wisconsin into our south. Traditionally, if we are, not always, but certainly a lot of the years we've had really, really severe drought conditions across this entire region, the place where we normally start seeing it first is kind of down here to our south and southeast. So if we start seeing, they go bone dry in southern Illinois and Missouri, Arkansas, Kansas, that oftentimes starts spreading toward our north and northwest. So the fact they are showing above average favored across a lot of that region means that that area to our south and southeast, where we get our fetch of moisture from in the summer, if that stays moist, that means we're not necessarily sucking any of that extra moisture out by the time it gets to us. I think one of the reasons we do see drought move more toward the north and northwest in the summer is often because if that southerly fetch or southeasterly fetch of wind has less moisture than normal, then that means we're getting less return up here. So if it's not super dry down there, that's good for us. Now the drought that's to the north and northwest of us could also be problems. We do get some winds from that region. So if those are drier than usual, I think there's a long-standing drought up there, then that could maybe offset that a little bit. In terms of what the CPC is showing for temperature and precipitation, so they are in agreement with the European model in terms of being warm in the west, not necessarily showing a strong warm signal here across a lot of the central U.S. So again, that's another point that's showing that, okay, maybe this year will be okay, at least in this area. And they are showing drier than average favored western half of the state, certainly a lot of the western U.S. Weather than average favored further east. So again, I'm cautiously, I would say just very cautiously optimistic that maybe we'll sneak by the season without at least getting a good portion of it in before we have any major issues with regard to drought. I do want to bring that up because though the modeling, some of the modeling centers I trust the most are not necessarily showing that as a signal right now. There is historical precedent for us to have a hot, dry summer across a lot of this part of the country in the years following where we had a warm, dry fall. So you'll notice if you just take the Corn Belt as a whole, so that's basically Nebraska to Ohio and Kansas up to Minnesota. So you take the Corn Belt as a whole, 2024 was almost kind of an outlier in terms of how warm and dry it was. Now November was wet enough further south and east here that, we weren't the driest on record, we weren't quite the warmest on record, but certainly in terms of if you combine the both, that we were, kind of off the little island there. And what I'm showing you here on the right is the upper atmospheric pattern last fall. So we had, a lot of troughing here off the Gulf of Alaska. We had downstream ridging that was basically just kind of centered over this continent, or over the center of this continent for a good portion of last fall. So, when you see those yellows and oranges, that basically means higher than average heights, means that's a ridge. You don't want to see upper atmospheric ridges planted over us during the growing season. Now in the winter, that means, it's going to be warmer. So if you like warm winters, that's not necessarily a bad signal, but in the summer you don't want that. Whoop. And what I'm showing you here is basically that the technical or literal reason that we've tended to see, these summers like this after following the fall, which, there's probably a land atmosphere component, from soils that were already dry that kind of help act as a feedback mechanism. But the atmosphere in, the following summer after a dry fall, so these are all the years with the warm, dry fall, so, going back to 1990, and this was the following summer. You'll notice, now they're not identical, but they look a lot alike. So the atmosphere is doing something very similar the following summer, at least for parts of that summer in a composite sense, what was doing that previous fall. So I just, I can't get up here and talk to you about this next growing season without telling you this is a possibility based on, historical precedent. Not saying this is not an official forecast, but this is something to watch out for. And I'll tell you what I think is the most telltale thing we have to watch for in the next couple of months is to see if this is actually the most likely scenario to come to fruition. But, if we look at temperature and precipitation, so I have precipitation here on the left and temperature on the right, the composite sense from June to August, we were not only warm, we were dry. Now, depending on, timing of precipitation and timing of the heat, that may not necessarily be catastrophic reductions in yield. You'll notice this is not just limited to northeast Nebraska or just Nebraska, so basically, the entire region was also warm and dry, so this would indicate at least the possibility of something that was closer to like 2012 or 1988, where we had a very large portion of the U.S. that was very warm and dry, which would probably mean big time reductions in crop yields. Okay, now the NME is the National Multi-Model Ensemble, so this is several different models kind of averaged together, and so they are showing something that looks like that. They are showing very dry, kind of bullseye on dryness across western Iowa and eastern Nebraska in terms of lack of precipitation. They are also showing very warm. So there is, now again, the NMME does, this is not the first time they've shown this. If the European was showing this to be, I would be a lot more concerned if this was a strong likelihood. They have shown this other years where this didn't happen. So I'm not necessarily on high, I'm not raising alarm bells just yet just based on this. But you'll notice that it is basically kind of in agreement with what happened in historical sense in terms of the composites. Okay, so what I'm really going to be watching out for as we move into the summer, if we're going to have something like that happen, there's probably a couple of things that that probably will be in place. One would be a lot of just persistent troughing here right off the west coast. And if we have that, we usually also concurrently have colder sea surface temperatures. So basically colder water basically from Alaska down off the coast of the Baja, so the entire eastern Pacific Basin tends to be colder than average, so you often do tend to have La Nina. So I'm basically showing you where we would see the La Nina, which is basically right here, and you'll notice here this blue means colder than average. So if we start going over, if we start seeing that water go over cold as we head into the spring and early summer, then the chances of what I just spent the last 5 minutes talking about happening, that is going to go up in a meaningful way, and that it would be a possibility. But right now, the projected sea surface temperatures are expected to be warmer than average off the coast of California. So that jives with what the European model was showing in terms of the temperature and precipitation. So when you have warmer water out here, you do tend, especially in the summer, you tend to have a lot more ridging off the west coast, which doesn't necessarily, that's not always our friend, but it's rarely our biggest enemy in this area. So I think as long as I think if this is the actual right solution on sea surface temperatures, then I feel fairly confident that we're not in for a horrible summer. That means it's going to be a great summer, but I think we're going to wait the worst case scenario if this is the right solution for the sea surface temperature. So again, I think this, in terms of what I'm really looking at the next couple of months for the summer forecast, it's this. Because I think if this is if this is what we have, I think we're probably going to be kind of okay here as we head into the season. But again, Mother Nature always throws surprises at us, so there's a reasonable chance that half what I just told you, or more than half what I told you, isn't right. Okay, just to kind of summarize what I've talked about. So we are expecting relatively cold temperatures, at least at times. I don't think we're looking at just weeks and weeks of bitterly cold, but we're certainly going to have more chances to get deeper cold air into here later this month in February. Last year we had very intense winter weather for about 10 days, 2 weeks of the winter basically kind of ended. I would not anticipate a repeat of that this year. I do think February will be a lot more average or traditional here in terms of temperature, and I do think we will start getting chances for a little bit more snowfall in here, even if we are maybe not necessarily looking at any big snowstorms coming on, at least in the immediate future. I definitely think as you go further east, we are looking at a more active weather pattern. Right now, I'm not really seeing any signs of a really warm spring. I think what the models to me, what they're showing, this kind of makes sense with a weak La Nina. There's more ridging further, off the west coast, so basically kind of Alaska and a little bit further west. It tends to be more troughs getting into the western and central United States, and that is not a recipe for us being warm. That is definitely a recipe for us getting more routine shots of colder air in here, and it would at least increase the chances of us starting to get a little bit more snowfall. So this could be a year where maybe we just haven't had squat for snowfall yet. Maybe we get all of it February, March this year. That certainly would not be the first time that's ever happened. We are expecting drier than average favored, further west and south. So again, I am very concerned about the drought in the western side of the state, and I do think there's going to be a reasonable chance that we see drought develop and get worse in the southern plains. And the good news is they have a lot of precipitation, historic precipitation, in some cases down there in late October, November. So that area did have some big improvements. I think for them that's great. Again, my official forecast for this summer is not, a catastrophic drought. But again, I cannot ignore historical precedent based on that dry summer, the historical precedent of a warm, dry summer after a warm, dry fall. And, NME is, I know means perfect, but, it is a reputable modeling center or model, and they are bullish on drought development across this region. European is not in agreement. I hope that's the right solution. Again, if we do get some decent moisture here in the spring, hopefully not, 2019 type precipitation, at least not that kind of frequency. But if we can get decent moisture in the ground by the time we get into July, if the spigot shuts off in August, that's not great, but that's better than spigot shutting off in June. Right now, that doesn't seem to be what's going to happen, but that could certainly change. And as always, I'll try to keep you guys as informed as I know how. And that's basically all I have. One more thing. So I started doing these webinars the second Tuesday of the month. They get put on Crop Watch. Crop Watch, I'll add the site here on the board. But next month, just because I know February is oftentimes people thinking about the types of insurance, and I know a lot of the decisions probably already been made, but I know there's a lot of critical decisions that have to be made, late February, March. So Eric and I are going to do a joint webinar together. Some will be focused on Nebraska, some of it will be a little bit more national, regional focused. Eric Snodgrass is one of the best meteorologists in the business. I would consider him a personal friend, and he and I are going to do something jointly together. Pay attention on Market Journal for more information, as I have been doing webinars via GNL Zoom, which I have to say, getting a license to set that up is more of a pain than it needs to be, and it can be hard to get other people on. So I may be doing it through Conduit, which is Eric's new company he works for. But regardless, this information will be made public to all of you on the Crop Watch page if you can't catch it live. It would be February 14th, so Valentine's Day at 9 o'clock in the morning. And again, this is my contact information. TikTok, that's probably not going to do you much good much longer, but I just started an Instagram page. It's the same thing other than there's a underscore between the E and the C. I'm not personally much for social media, but it is, I've actually found TikTok to be great for reaching a lot of people that I have no idea who they are, and they seem to be enjoying the videos. So from that standpoint, I'm sorry to see it maybe going away. But I also, again, Market Journal on Saturday mornings. Hopefully I'm telling you something useful most weeks. I do a podcast most every Thursday or Friday, just kind of talking a little bit more in depth than I can do at Market Journal. And on the State Climate Office webpage, I put out a weekly summary pretty much every week. The State Climate Office webpage is going to get an overhaul here relatively soon, so we will be updating it to, we are currently, it's outdated, and we are currently not in compliance with university standards, so we have to make an update. Okay, that's my story. Any questions?
Over there.
Yes.
Is our weather, comparing the last, say, 30 years, are we getting more of Kansas's weather and ours is going more north? Is everything shifting north?
We're definitely seeing some signs of that. If you look at like our plant hardiness zones, I mean, they've shifted northward. Certainly our early winters are a lot more like what Kansas probably had, or, you guys up here is probably more like south central, southeast Nebraska, a little bit less snow. We're staying warmer longer into most winters. I just said we had our fourth warmest December on record in the state. 3 out of the top 4, or since 2021. So 2021 was the third warmest. 2022 was a little colder than average, and 2023 was the warmest December on record, and then last year was fourth warmest. So I would say 2024, the reason we ended up second warmest had nothing to do with last summer. Last summer was really not that hot. It was very, very warm in February. We had this kind of consistently just a little above average in the spring, and then we were very warm in September, October, November, December. So that's what did it. Other questions? Yes.
Why were we getting such strong southerly winds last year? Day after day after day, 20, 30 mile an hour winds.
Well, we probably had, you get really strong winds from having a tight pressure gradient, and we probably just had it.
Weeks on end.
You get, in the spring, you tend to have systems coming in and out. That means you have high pressure, usually somewhere to our west, and low to our east, or vice versa. That means you're going to have strong winds. But yeah, I think there was periods of time last year where we just had kind of ridging further toward the east, and we had a lot of troughs off to the west. So we just was opening up strong southerly flow.
Why did it bring such humidity up from the Gulf?
Some of that some of that was coming up from Mexico and Texas, where they were in drought, so that was sapping some of the moisture. I mean, it really depends. I mean, I always like looking at like where air masses are coming from. And sometimes they're not always coming exactly where you think they're coming from. And what we want is from that fetch from the Gulf to basically just go over Louisiana and Arkansas. If it sneaks goes west over Texas, it tends to get more depleted of moisture before it comes up straight north, if that makes sense. So that's basically what was kind of happening at times last year.
One more question.
Yes.
Is there any correlation with weather patterns between the year solar cycle?
Probably a little bit.
We're at the peak right now.
I mean, you do tend to be a little bit warmer at the peak of the solar cycle than at the minimum, but there's not necessarily like the strongest correlation with that. But we have probably historically we do have a tendency to probably have more of our major droughts when we are at the peak than we're at the minimum, but it's not like that's the strongest indicator. Yes.
I have some people that they think the tornado belt that come up from Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska has shifted further east. Is that something in accordance with your findings?
That there is research that does show that at least in the last several decades, last 2 or 3 decades, that has shifted east. There is uncertainty as if that is actually a permanent shift. But yeah, granted, last year we had a lot of tornadoes, severe weather in eastern Nebraska. That was the first year we really had that in a long time. But we have definitely seen more of that, Arkansas, Ohio, Indiana, than what we probably historically. And a lot of that really is because we have seen a change in the behavior of the low-level jet. So we tend to get, the low-level jet is formed because you have strong temperature differences between the Rocky Mountains and places further east. That temperature gradient has weakened over time as it's gotten warmer in the west. So that low-level jet its behavior has just changed a little bit, and the change of its behavior is such that it's pushed a little bit further toward the east, so that has made places like Arkansas and southeast Missouri, Kentucky, like that area, the mid-south, lower Midwest is maybe now a little bit more favored region for tornadoes. But that's certainly not to mean we don't have to worry about tornadoes anymore, and we certainly have a lot of experience around this part of the country with hail. There are places, I think there's farmers in the state that I think for 3 consecutive years have had their crop wiped out by hail in early July. Right around Waco. And then last year had a catastrophic hail event on I think July 6th, kind of from east of North Platte through Lexington over toward south of Kearney.
Some of them twice a year, right?
Yeah, I guess it's the first time a storm missed something. Other questions?
What exactly is the European model and who's involved in that?
What's that?
The European model, what is it? Who's involved in it?
So the European model is basically a joint effort by the United Kingdom and other European countries. So they basically pull their money together. It's statistically superior just because they do a better job of handling. It's complicated, but they do what we call data assimilation. They do a much better job of that than what the U.S. does with NCEP. So the GFS is the U.S.'s main model. The Europeans just run their model better, is how I would put it. But it's a joint effort by the UK and the countries of the European Union. And it's been that way for a long time. Their data is not cheap. So on your phone apps, a lot of the times you're probably getting is just some sort of downscaling or some sort of magic that companies will do with the U.S.'s GFS data, because that data is free for all of us in the U.S. So it's for taxpayer dollars to work.